Hey guys, Coach Gaglione here. There's another edition of our Powerlifting for the People podcast. We're kind of continuing our series and kind of our episode kind of theme about our programming philosophy. And today I want to kind of talk about warm-ups, and we're going to talk about just preparation for like your workout in general. I think it's an important topic, and I think there's definitely some debate in the powerlifting community and definitely in the strength and conditioning community. So I wanted to kind of just relay my thoughts on warm-up and just preparation for the workout in general. One of the things that, again, of people that are listening that don't know, I've been involved in competitive powerlifting, the sport of powerlifting for going on 13 years now. I've been in business for going on 8 years now. This will be my 8th year in business. And also been involved with coaching and personal training, again, for the last 12 to 13 years. And my start with was actually, I did not only strength and conditioning, but I also did the skill coaching for football and wrestling was definitely my main sport, both as an athlete and as a coach. But that being said, I have a little bit of a more unique perspective when it comes to like warming up and movement in general. I think that definitely separates myself from some of the other maybe powerlifting coaches that only have the powerlifting background itself. So I definitely have a little bit more of an appreciation for, I think, for movement in general. And just some other aspects. So I definitely have learned a lot over the years from not just powerlifting and powerlifting coaches and powerlifting athletes, but also strength and conditioning coaches and kind of their philosophies. So a lot of that stuff, and one of the things I want to give a lot of credit to is Coach Michael Boyle, which sounds kind of funny if you know who Michael Boyle is, because he's kind of probably one of the biggest proponents for not doing like a loaded barbell back squat. So it sounds kind of funny coming from a powerlifter, but Mike Boyle has been like a great influence, and he's someone I hold in high regard as one of the best strength conditioning experts in the world. And I think is someone that we could all like learn from, even though I might not agree with 100% of everything that he says. I think that there's a lot to be learned in it from him. So one of the reasons I want to bring Michael Boyle up, so Michael Boyle and Gray Cook kind of popularized the idea of what's called the joint-by-joint theory. Again, I know this is like mostly an auditory format, so this may not be the best place to do this, but I think it's still hopefully will be worthwhile for you guys. But essentially, the joint-by-joint theory is that the body is a series of stacked joints, and some joints need more mobility, and some joints need more stability. And how you train them and how you kind of warm up and things like that, and how you kind of utilize exercise selection is going to kind of be dictated by this joint-by-joint theory. So if you kind of work from the ground up, you kind of want some, and if you want to get like kind of really specific, some people talk about like you want big toe mobility and stuff like that. But anyway, you want to have stable feet, you want to have mobile ankles, you want to have stable knees, you want to have mobile hips, you want to have a stable kind of low back and stable trunk, okay? You want to have a mobile upper back. Okay, and then so on and so forth. You can kind of continue to go. You want some scapular stability, and obviously you want some. There's going to be some crossover, especially when you get to the upper body. You definitely want some shoulder mobility. You want some elbow stability, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of continue to break down these things. And if you also research some coaches like Charlie Weingroff and Gray Cook, they'll kind of dive into these concepts even greater. But I'm just kind of giving a general overview, and especially one of the main stuff when it comes to terms of powerlifting, usually we focus on more of a condensed view, and we want to look at ankles. We want to look at ankles, hips, and knees. Ankles, knees, hips, and then the back, and then the low back and the upper back specifically. So by utilizing like kind of the joint-by-joint approach, it kind of helps us dictate how we approach our warm-ups, how we approach movement in general, and how we approach our technique in general. So if you kind of look at, in general, we want to make sure that one of our big cues, we always want to try to have a rib cage stacked over our pelvis. So we don't want to necessarily overextend the low back. We don't want to overflex the low back. So if we can kind of keep that stacked position, that's going to be very important. Another kind of piece, so one of our big three kind of master cues, and this is kind of derived and kind of popularized from Chris Duffin and Kabuki Strength. Basically, we want to make sure that we're always rooting with our feet. That's going to give us a stable foundation. We want to make sure that we breathe and brace so we have a stable trunk, and we want to make sure we bend the bar, and that's going to create a lot of lat tension. and tension in the upper back. And by doing that, it's going to allow us to have, utilize the mobility in our ankles, in our hips, in our thoracic spine, and it's going to allow us to have a lot of stability in our knees, our feet, and our low back. So those are going to be some of the primary considerations when we're talking about bench, squat, and deadlift. It's going to allow us the strongest foundation and allow us the best technique. It's going to allow us to express the most strength while reducing injury risk and optimizing performance. So going back to the joint by joint theory, we want to train some movements for stability and some movements for more mobility, and we're going to look at the joints and the muscles kind of associated with those items. So when we talk about, there's some different schools of thought, but for us at Gaglione Strength, we do believe that there's a lot of value in doing some general warm-ups before specific warm-ups. And there's definitely some debate on this. And in general, if you're a healthy individual, could you just start with the empty bar and just kind of get going with your training session? You absolutely could. But when it comes to longevity, there's that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure, or something along those lines. But basically, like by doing those mobility drills and these activation drills and these more general warm-ups, it's going to allow you to continue to move better and kind of get a little bit ahead of the game when it comes to preventing injuries, making sure that you're not allowing movement dysfunction to occur, and allow you to kind of continue to work on your technique. So a lot of the things that we do in the warm-ups specifically are going to help kind of drill certain patterns. Whether we talk about, a lot of times people talk about glute firing or lat activation or bent in the bar or bracing your stomach. And obviously we want to do those things under the bar, but if we kind of practice those things and kind of unload it, but in the same positions that we're going to be when we're benching, squatting, and deadlifting, I do think there's a lot of value in that. And we can practice those in a low kind of threshold environment. We don't have to do those. So if we're practicing those in like a low risk environment, by the time we get to say a 400, 500, 600 pound, 700 pound lift, we're going to be more prepared in our body and our nervous system to be kind of ready to do those things. So that's kind of our philosophy, and that's why we utilize general warm-ups. Not to say that, and we'll kind of get into specific warm-ups a little bit later in this episode, but I want to spend a little bit more time on general warm-ups. So we do have a warm-up product as well. We could probably include the links in the description below, but we have some resources on that as well if you're kind of interested in getting checking out a seminar and product that kind of covers this into more detail. So you can check out that as well. Moving on so there's going to be 3 key areas for mobility and 3 key areas for stability. There are some different schools of thought on whether you should do the mobility or stability first. One school of thought is that if you do the mobility exercises first and then do the stability exercises second, you will kind of be able to kind of practice and kind of allow that new mobility to stick. Again, that's just a theory. And the other school of thought might just be if you're training groups and things, you want to maybe just logistically. So a lot of times when we're training groups, we'll start in a supine position, then we'll go to prone, then we'll go to an on all fours, a quadruped position, and half kneeling and standing. So you can kind of just sequence from kind of the ground up that way. That's definitely a certain approach that you want to make things kind of flow nicely. That being said, I don't think there's any right or wrong way to kind of implement these things as far as which you do first. There's definitely some merit in both ways. Do what kind of works for you in your situation. If you're on your own, kind of do what works for you. I do think that the most important thing is that you're just kind of getting this stuff in. I would even go as far as to say you don't necessarily have to do these before you work out. I think if you kind of just do these movements throughout the week, I think that's fine. So for example, Stuart McGill, if you have some lower back problems, a lot of that activation stuff for the trunk and the glutes and the lats, he's a big advocate for that. So you can check out Stuart McGill, and you can also check out The Gift of Injury by Stuart McGill and Brian Carroll if you want to kind of learn more about breathing and bracing and just low back stability and trunk stability. That's going to be really important. And so Stuart McGill will advocate his big 3 exercises, which is the curl up, the bird dog, and the rolling plank, and those are done with high tension to kind of really activate the core musculature and help spare the low back. So he'll kind of talk about doing those 10-minute walks in addition to the McGill Big 3 several times throughout the day to kind of build up that capacity for the low back. So the main reason that I would advocate doing these warm-ups before every session, before every workout, is just so you just get in the habit of doing them, and it's only going to usually take anywhere from, on the low end, 5 to 7 minutes, and on the high end, 7 to 15 minutes if you're a little bit more jacked up. But if you have time for like an hour training session, I think you have time to spend 5 minutes on kind of mobility and stability work. So that's just kind of a general overview of kind of why you'd want to do it and kind of how you'd organize it. Now let's kind of get into the actual exercise selection, and we have a lot of videos on our YouTube channel kind of outlining some of these exercises in more detail. So definitely check out our YouTube channel, Gaglione Strength, or youtube.com/Gaglione Strength for some more in-depth tutorials on actually how to do these movements properly. It's a little bit outside the scope, so we're just going to talk about the specifics and not actually the execution of all the exercises. We're just going to talk about just categorizing the exercises and organizing the warm-up for the sake of today's topic. So like I mentioned before, typically when we train in groups, we'll kind of start supine and kind of work our way up, but throughout the whole movement sequence, we're going to again work on mobility and stability in 3 areas. So this is like our 6 these are our 6 main keys for a perfect powerlifting warm-up. So we want to make sure that we mobilize the ankle joint, specifically in the movement that's called dorsiflexion. So that's the ability to, if you're listening to this and not watching, it's the ability to kind of pull your toe toward your shin. That's going to allow you, if you are a feet flat bencher with your feet tucked back, if you are a more narrow stance or high bar or medium stance squatter, even a low bar stance squatter for raw, I would say besides an equipped lifter, you're going to have some sort of shin angle in order to reach proper depth. So ankle mobility is going to be important for those types of lifters. If you're an equipped lifter or a really wide stance squatter and you have a more vertical shin angle, the ankle mobility is not as important. But that being said, ankle mobility is important for the conventional deadlift. It's important for certain stances of benching, and it's important for certain stances of squatting, especially deep squatting. If you're a weightlifter, if you're a strongman, if you're someone that wants to squat excessively deep, ankle mobility is very important. This is why people actually wear squat shoes, because squat shoes actually provide what I would consider artificial ankle mobility. The squat shoe actually puts you a little bit in what's called plantar flexion, so it gives you some additional degrees of dorsiflexion to allow you to go deeper into the hole. That's why people wear squat shoes, besides the actual stability of the shoe itself. It's going to give you a little bit more range of motion in the ankle, which is why someone can almost always squat more to a greater degree of depth when they're wearing a weightlifting shoe or a heeled shoe. So ankle mobility is going to be the first key for mobility. The second key for mobility is your hips. Now hips, we're actually going to need some stability in the hips as well, but in general, the hip is going to be a joint that needs more mobility. We're going to need hip extensions, the ability to extend the hip. The ability to extend the hip is going to help you lock out deadlifts, and it's going to help you lock out your squat, of course. It's also going to help you get into a better bench arch because you can pull your legs further backwards. So hip extension, the more hip extension you have, the greater the ability for you to spare your low back and allow your back not to go into lower back extension when you're doing a big bench arch or when you're locking out a deadlift. So hip extension is very important. You're also going to need a lot of hip external rotation and a little bit of abduction as well. So that's the ability to kind of force your knees out and kind of drive your knees out and rotate the hip out to the side. The wider stance squat you have or a sumo deadlift, you're going to require a little bit more external rotation, and even like a more wide stance bencher as well. Some people like to bench with their feet out. External rotation is going to be very important for those types of wide stance squatters, benches, and deadlifts. For the sumo deadlift as well. It's going to be very, very important. Also, just some general groin adductor flexibility is going to be important as well. So you're going to have some mobility in multiple planes of movement for the hip. If you like to squat with your toes more straight ahead, some actually internal rotation is going to be important for a more toes forward squatter. It's not necessarily necessary that you do this, but just in general, if you want to be able to squat with your toes, if that's something you just would like to do, if you'd like to squat with your toes a little bit more straight ahead, having adequate internal rotation is also important for the squat. For the conventional deadlift and for like a deep squat, some hip flexions, the ability to bring your leg up. Hip flexion is going to be important as well. Sometimes that's more of a stability concern, but it's something worth mentioning. So again, like I mentioned before, for mobility for the hip, you're going to need to do that in multiple planes and multiple directions as well. Thoracic spine. So your upper back, you're going to want some mobility, so you can, in order for you to kind of keep your chest up. In our natural posture, you have a lordotic or a slight arch in your low back, and you have a slight kyphosis or kind of rounding or a little bit of flexion in your upper back. So in order for you to kind of achieve a more what we consider a neutral spine, you're going to need some upper back extension. For other sports, you could also consider work on rotation, things like that. For powerlifting, like the rotary component is really not as important. Having some rotation in your thoracic spine is going to be important for general health. So you can kind of argue if you want to have a little bit more stiffness in your spine, but in general, extension is going to be important in the upper back in order for you to achieve a good bench arch, again, to limit the amount of excessive extension in your low back when you're arching. It's going to allow you to kind of keep your chest up when you're doing a deadlift or a squat as well. So when people kind of use that cue chest up, we still want to keep the rib cage stacked over the pelvis, but we want to obviously keep that chest up, and that's going to allow us to kind of hold that neutral position. If we don't have a lot of range of motion in our upper back, a lot of times we'll kind of be limited to a more rounded over position, and you're not going to be able, it's mechanically not going to be maybe as advantageous as someone who's able to get a little bit more extension to say this at the start of a deadlift, at the bottom of a squat, or when setting up for an arch for the bench press. So you're going to definitely need to work on some mobility. And depending on the athlete and how their arm length and things like that, you also maybe potentially could need to work on shoulder mobility as well. So the ability to externally rotate is going to help if you do any type of like overhead pressing, if you do any type of low bar squatting, that's going to be important as well. The ability to extend the shoulder and internally rotate the shoulder is going to be important in order to kind of hit the bottom position of a bench press. In order to do close grip bench pressing, it's going to be important, any type of full range benching. And also just in order to kind of keep the shoulders in a good position when you're deadlifting as well. So shoulder extension can be important consideration as well when we're talking about the shoulder. So that's kind of some things what you want to do to kind of attack mobility. We have a lot of different videos on our YouTube channel kind of going over some different mobility drills. We like different kind of lunge and squat flow variations for general mobility. We like kind of different shin box and kind of pigeon poses for hip mobility. And there's a lot of different just very simple ankle dorsiflexion drills you could do with or without bands. You could do band distraction work, things like that. So that would be kind of mobility drills, and those are the joints you want to kind of attack in terms of mobility. So moving on to stability. So when it talks, we definitely want some foot stability. So any type of single leg type work or any type of balancing or kind of rooting drills are going to be important. That's not like we don't really consider that kind of the big three. And even I talked about shoulders as usually. So again, the big three for mobility would be our ankles, our hips, and our thoracic spine. Kind of a bonus one would be like our shoulders, depending on how tight you are. And for stability, kind of our big three things we want to activate. We want to activate the muscles in our trunk. We want to activate the muscles in our kind of hips and our glutes. And we want to activate the muscles in our lats and upper back. So that's going to kind of give us scapular stability. It's going to give us trunk or lower back stability. And that's going to give us kind of stability at the knee joint if we're kind of firing at our hips appropriately. It's going to allow us to kind of keep our knees tracking. And then the fourth one, which would be, could be like a bonus stability thing, would be just kind of rooting and having stability at the feet. So when it comes to, we'll talk about kind of glutes first. We talked about we want to have the ability to kind of abduct and externally rotate. We also want the ability to kind of extend. So one thing I think it's important when we do warm-up, so we mentioned the kind of the bird dog, we mentioned some different quadruped like abduction and extension and things like that. We want the ability to kind of fire the glute explosively, but we also want the ability to be able to statically hold those positions. So if you think of something like a Mark Bell hip circle, or you're kind of driving the knees out, it's going to teach your body to kind of hold that tension in your glutes. A lot of people kind of talk about screwing their feet in the ground and kind of rotating their feet on the floor. So anytime you can kind of create torque and tension at the hip joint, that's going to allow for better knee tracking and allow your knees to track the feet and prevent your knees from going into that valgus or that knees in position, which is kind of an unsafe position. And again, it could happen when you're at max weights, but in general, you want to kind of force your knees out. You want to have your knees in general stacked over the ankles to keep a good mechanical position. Same thing with a sumo deadlift. If the knees kind of come in on a sumo deadlift, the bar is going to kind of get out in front. Oftentimes when the knees kind of collapse in, that also could be sometimes the next step up. When your knees come in, oftentimes your lower back rounds, the bar gets out in front of the foot, and then the lift is usually kind of over at that point. So glute firing, when we talk about glute activation and kind of learning to use the glutes, not just for to produce force, but also for stability. It's also going to help kind of stabilize the pelvic position. We talked about having the rib cage stacked over the pelvis. So controlling your glutes with different bridges and quadruped exercises and bird dogs and things like that are going to be very important. And we love using the Mark Bell hip circle as well, whether that be squats with RMT with the hip circle or just any type of walking exercises with the hip circle as well. So moving on to the trunk or the low back, we want to have a lot of stability in our abs. So in order for us to keep that stacked rib cage and pelvis position, we're going to need to really learn to breathe and brace. So utilizing a combination of our breath to create more intra-abdominal pressure combined with statically contracting the diaphragm. If you can imagine the diaphragm is like a balloon, it's going to compress down and contract in all directions. So you don't want to just push the belly out. We want to push the belly out to the front, to the sides, and the back. We want circumferential expansion of the diaphragm. So practicing your exercises like your planks, planks in all variations. You could do anti-rotation presses if you want to work on rotary stability. We talked about bird dogs before, which is kind of a combination exercise. The rolling plank, the side planks in all the different variations. You can do side plank clamshells, you can do side planks with hip flexion. There's a host of all different exercises you could do. But the goal of the trunk stability, so in the case of a plank, that's going to be resisting extension of the back. That's going to kind of teach you to keep a neutral spine. If you're doing a side plank, that's going to teach you to resist lateral flexion. It's going to allow you to kind of get those obliques firing a little bit better. So any type of static ab movement is going to be really, really important. Of course, some flexion and some things for just general strength is fine. But in general, for a power lifter, more core stability or trunk stability exercises for a small amount of time, a short duration, high intensity, high bracing effect, that's going to be key for learning to stabilize the trunk and protect the low back. And again, we want to combine that, the breathing with the bracing when we're doing these exercises. So that's going to kind of cover the majority of what we consider trunk stability, or or trunk or like abdominal kind of stability activation exercises for the power lifter. Moving on, there's a lot of different variations that you can kind of do. So in general, when we're talking about powerlifting and not necessarily general health, or this is not necessarily even how we would necessarily perform rowing exercises all the time, but in general, when we're doing a bench press, a squat, or deadlift, we're going to want to have the scapula kind of pinned down. There is going to be some sort of scapular humeral rhythm when you're doing something like an overhead press, or you're doing lat pull downs or rows and things like that. But in general, for powerlifting, we want to have a stable shoulder joint, and in order to do that, we're going to kind of pin down the scapula. We talk about pulling the scapula down and back, so we want to kind of retract and depress the shoulder blades, and we want to hold those in position. So by, obviously the scapular retractors and depressing muscles are going to be important. So even doing exercises like we had a video with Black Tom Cruise, just doing like a scap pull-up where we're kind of working on depressing the scapula, or a row with a retraction, or just holding. Some people call those chest supported row shrugs and things like that. It's really just a retraction, but the ability to hold that retraction in place is going to be really important. So all the muscles around the shoulder blades and the upper back, the rhomboids, the rear delts are going to be really important to kind of build those up. We like to do a lot of exercises prone, so we do like a prone shoulder surfer series where you can kind of practice lat tension in different positions. That's going to be really key. Any type of isometric kind of flex arm hang, so like an isometric pull-up, an isometric row. You could obviously do it's more band pull aparts with holds, or rear delt bands with holds, or rows with holds. Donnie Thompson really likes, you'll do like band row holds for like 30 seconds to a minute, a little bit longer duration. But in general, you want to learn to contract the lats and upper back statically. That's going to hold your shoulder blades in shoulder position. In general, we want to kind of get out of that kind of forward posture. We want to get the shoulders kind of posterior. We want to retract it back and down. and that's going to create a stable shelf for the squat. It's going to create a better position for the deadlift, so your arms are nice and long. The lats are going to engage, so you keep the bar close to your body. In the case of a bench press, it's going to shorten the range of motion and put your shoulder in a safe position. So having more scapular stability and lat activation, upper back activation is going to be key for powerlifting. Now that being said, there could be some merit to letting the scapula move when you're doing rows and things like that for assistance work, just for general health. But again, we're talking about powerlifting specifically right now. So for that case, as a warm-up, as a primer, we're going to want to do more isometric type exercises where the scapula is more pinned, and then we're going to kind of practice pinning down our shoulder blades so we can kind of get practice for that for the actual competition movements. So at this point, if you want to pick anywhere from 3 to 5 movements that are going to kind of satisfy those 6 criteria. You might spend a little bit more time on problem areas. You might spend a little bit more time on certain movement patterns, depending on if you're doing a squat, a bench press, or a deadlift focused session. So there's a lot of different kind of variables here. Again, if you want more information, we have a warm-up product that will kind of go into this stuff into a little bit more greater detail. But I just want to kind of give you guys some ideas when you're kind of organizing a general warm-up. The general warm-up, again, should take you most of the time 5 to 7 minutes. If you're really jacked up, it could take you, when I say jacked up, just maybe a little bit tired, a little bit more fatigued, a little bit more, you have more restrictions or movement dysfunctions. It could take you somewhere upwards of 15 minutes, okay? If you do these exercises kind of quickly and with intent, you want to do these with intent and purpose, don't just kind of go through the motions, you should break a sweat and allow for your body temperature to increase as well. So you're going to get a lot of benefits of a general warm-up, but also practicing the movement patterns that you're going to be doing under the bar. At this point, then you would start to do your specific warm-ups, would be actually practicing the movement, rehearsing the movement of the squat, the bench press, or the deadlift, depending on what you're doing for your primary exercise for that particular session. In general, you're going to have anywhere from 3 to 5 warm-ups before you hit your primary working sets. The reason why we like this kind of 3 to 5 number, and sometimes if you're really strong, maybe upwards of 6 warm-ups, in general, that's about a lot of times how long you're going to have to take when you actually get to a competition as well. Depending on the federation, you're going to have anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes to warm up before. That's usually on the average time a flight takes, depending on how well the meet is run and how many competitors there are. So by allowing yourself to practice kind of a similar kind of tempo, I think that's beneficial for getting your body kind of ready for competition. In general, unless you're trying to just increase your volume a little bit, or you just want a little bit more practice with technique, or you just a little bit, again, more jacked up, and you need a little bit more reps to kind of get warm, like literally physically warm and kind of lubricate the joints. In general, I advocate for more sets and less repetitions when you're doing warm-up sets. So you're just practicing your setup, you're not really wasting your energy. It's more just get your nervous system ready and kind of rehearse the movement. I think it's important to get within, say somewhere in the neighborhood of within 5 to 10% of your working sets for your last warm-up. And I also think it's important, again, to do your warm-ups kind of fairly quickly. That way you're kind of not wasting too much time at the session. As a general rule of thumb, you might start off with bigger jumps when you're doing your general warm-ups, and then you go into smaller jumps. But in general, I like this there's like a general kind of 10% rule. So for example, if you're a 300-pound bencher, maybe your average warm-up jump would be around 30 pounds. Let's say you're doing working sets at like 255. Maybe in the beginning, you're taking 50-pound jumps, and then you're taking 30-pound jumps on average. And then when you get closer to your working sets, maybe you're only taking 10, 15, or 20-pound jumps. Let's say maybe you're doing working sets between 255 and 270. On average, maybe you'll warm up with 95, 135, and then you'll again start taking your 30-pound jumps, 165, 195, 225, and then once you get to 225, maybe you slow down a little bit, maybe you go 245 for a single, and then your first working set is 255, for example. So on average, your average is going to be about 10%, so it's going to be about 30 pounds. Let's say if you're like a 500-pound squatter, maybe your average jump is 50 pounds. So again, you might just go from the bar to a plate, then you might go like a plate quarter, you might even go 2 plates, depending on how prepared you are. And then maybe you go from 2 plates to 2 plates and a quarter, you go 275, then 315, 365, and then maybe you take a 40-pound jump, so a little bit less than 10%, and then maybe your first working set is at 405 or 415, and somewhere in that range. And then maybe if you're like working up to something, doing some heavy triples at like 455 or something like that, maybe you start to take 20 or 30-pound jumps. After that's a little bit smaller jump once you get past 400. So that's another example of kind of how you would kind of do warm-ups for that. Like when I'm in my equipment, when I'm working up to like 800 or whatever, a lot of times I'm taking plate jumps. I might take 1, 2, 3 plates in a row. I might put my briefs on, and then I'll take 4 plates, 5 plates, 6 plates. I might go to 7 plates, and then once I get to 7 plates, now I'm going to take smaller jumps. So 10% for an 800-pound squatter is going to be about 80 pounds. So my average jump is going to be about 80 pounds. So a lot of times I'm going to be taking plate jumps, and then when I get to my working sets, my working sets I might take somewhere between 40 and 50-pound jumps, just for the sake of time. So equipped lifter is also going to be a little bit different as well. So that'd be more of like your specific warm-ups. Again, especially if I'm trying to do like a rep max, or if I'm trying to work up to a top set. Again, I recommend doing doubles, triples, and singles as your warm-ups. If you're trying to increase your volume and just get more work in, if you're doing sets of 5 or sets of 8 for the day, and you want to just get a little bit more volume in, you can certainly do 5s and 8s working up into your working sets. But as you get stronger, you're probably going to need to, again, probably drop your reps a little bit in your warm-ups just to kind of conserve your energy. So that's kind of a good rule of thumb when you talk about like kind of specific warm-ups. When you talk about warming up into a competition, you can certainly do some of those kind of general warm-ups as needed, but especially on game day, you probably don't need to do as much of that kind of like fluffy stuff with mobility and stuff. You should be well rested and tapered. Maybe you only do like 1 or 2 or 3 kind of general things, and then again you hit like 5 kind of warm-ups, kind of go in 5 or 6 warm-ups going kind of into the contest. So again, for me, I might take, let's say from using myself as an example, I kind of plan on opening around like 750 at my next contest. I might go 1, 2, 3 plates like all in a row. I might even consider that just like one set. Put my briefs on. I might go 4, 5 plates, 6 plates, and then I'll go like around 7 plates, which is with the squat bars and the collars. I might take 700 for my final warm up with a loose knee wrap, and then I'll go hit the platform and take 750 for like somewhere between 745, 750 for my opener, and then kind of just go from there. So, and that's, like I said, most people aren't squatting 800 pounds that are probably listening to this, so it's a more extreme example, but you kind of get the idea. For like a deadlift, I might go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 1/4, and then like open at around 585 or 600. For example, there's another example for that. So sometimes if you're kind of dealing with an injury or kind of a lagging body part, you may need to warm up a little bit more and do a couple more sets, so you can kind of take those into consideration. But that's some kind of general advice for specific warm-ups. I think that kind of covers it for warm-ups. So definitely check out the links below. Thank you guys for listening. If you guys are enjoying this content, please let us know. And thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. And until next time, guys, stay strong, and we'll see you soon.